What's going on, beautiful people? I have been keeping planted tanks for about 5.5 years now, approaching 6 actually maybe. But in that time, I've learned so much stuff. Stuff is probably not the best way to describe it, but we'll go with that. Here's some stuff for you in this video. Now, over those nearly 6 years, like the way I do a tank has evolved like massively compared to when I started. When I started, I didn't have money for things like Aquasoil and all that kind of thing. So I was left with just like gravel and like some root tabs, and it worked well. It worked pretty darn well, I have to say, but it didn't work as well as it could, and it took a lot longer for the whole tank to get going. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you how to set up a tank to get the plants growing very quickly, because that is the most key factor in keeping algae and like maintenance at bay. No one wants algae, no one wants maintenance. It just like ruins the experience. So if you can follow these tips, it should get you off to a flying start. Now, obviously everyone's got different water parameters that have to be taken into account, but I've applied the same tips that I have down here in the southwest of our country with the whole other side that's got liquid rock water, and both tanks are doing absolutely brilliantly. So I know it can work in like a number of different water types. Is types the right word? Parameters, I guess. But that's good. It means the majority of you should be able to do this. Now, I am going to start with lighting, because when most people are starting to get in this hobby, they pretty quickly pick up that it's important, but they put it right to the top of the list. But they don't put it up to the top of the list for the right reasons. They put it up there because the more powerful, the more light, the better the plants will grow, which is, in fact, probably true, but only when you've got all the other aspects in place and doing really well. So I can pretty much grow plants with any light I've got. Not all plants though. So what I do is I look at the tank, plants we've got, or make choices beforehand and pick the light accordingly. So for instance, if I've got a lot of epiphyte plants that stick to the wood, and some really short stems at the back that need to grow in, I'll make sure I get a light that I know is adjustable for a start, because you will not need a ton of light to begin with until those plants really get going. All that will happen is the tank will just turn into an algae fest, which will go in time. You know, as the plants in the background grow taller, they'll start to get more vibrant, big, you know, because of the extra light. But quite often, a lot of people will just tear the tank down before it's even got to that stage, and possibly quit the hobby as well. And that's the one thing that I really don't want them to do, because if you can get a win with your first tank, I mean, you're going to get your second, your third, and your fourth, aren't you? Because it's so addictive. When you know you can grow the plants, like the possibilities and the type of scapes you want to do, kind of endless. So for me, the light intensity is not as important as everyone thinks, depending on what your goals are. And also, when you first get into a hobby, you're not going to jump straight in with the best equipment, are you? Like, you don't even know if you're going to really enjoy it or anything. So I always say, get a nice budget light, pick some easy plants, get them looking beautiful and growing, some nice fish in there, enjoy the whole thing. Then you can start to upgrade either the current setup you've got or the next one. Now, showing light intensity and what is correct for each tank is quite difficult on camera, because cameras adjust, but I'm going to show some clips of what I consider to be like low lighting, what I consider to be medium lighting, and then high lighting. And what I can kind of do is balance the camera's settings so that you're seeing it depending on the brightness of your screen again, so there's so many variables, but you can see then what I would class as the difference. Again, it's not going to be a perfect reference, but I think it's better than nothing, and it gives you some sort of idea as to what plants will be good with what intensity. So yeah, pick the lighting in terms of what you're going for. For instance, on my Mabuna tank, there's no plants in there at all. So if I was to put big bright lights up there, first of all, fish probably wouldn't like it that much. Second of all, it would just be an algae fest everywhere. So what I did instead is I got 3 lights, probably could have done it with 2, but I went for 3 at a lower intensity so we get a really good coverage. You get a nice rippling effect because I've gone for the spotlights as well. But also there's just a background level of like slight little bit of greenness on the rock, which actually I think works really well with the Mabunas, and it gives a food source for any sucker fish and things like that as well. And here's the other one. Do you go with a strip light or do you go with the spotlights? That one is pretty much just personal choice. Some tanks look really great with the strip light because say you've got a ton of stems, and it gives like a really even coverage. They all grow towards the light in the same direction. Whereas if you want to go for a more sort of natural rivery vibe with a real flicking water surface, you know, you've got some fast flow going across, spotlights work so well for that, shimmering on the bottom. I think that's my favorite look personally. But if I was going for a full-on stem heavy, all the colors trimmed back in that way, then I'd go with like a proper strip light, RGB, and decent power as well, because if it's packed full of plants, it can take more power for sure. Also, light intensity is dependent on things like CO2. If you're putting CO2 in your tank, ramping it up, the plants are growing super fast, you're putting fertilizers in, they can handle it because they're growing so fast they're going to outcompete all of the algae. Apologies for anyone getting annoyed by me saying algae, that's how we say it here. Sometimes I accidentally say algae nowadays and my wife's like, what? Anyway, yeah, so pick the light that is, you know, perfect for what you're doing. If you're like, been in the hobby for a year or so, you want to upgrade, get a high powered light. You can still grow plants in a low tech way with a high powered light and no CO2 at all. But I would always recommend not starting like that. Start lower power and ramp up as they grow, as the tank settles in more. You know, just going straight in, it can work. And every now and again it does, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's a lot more work to begin with, a lot more maintenance, that sort of thing. And I'm the sort of person who wants to set up a tank and just pretty much leave it until it's settled in. And I've got to a point now where I can do that quite a bit. A little bit of glass scraping, some diatoms always appear, but you can get some suckerfish or when I say suckerfish, I mean like bristlenose, or you can get some amanos and things like that. And most of the time when I put a couple of those in there, just the little medium-sized ones in the tank. A small tank, I'll put one in. A bigger tank, I'll put like 2 or 3 in. And by the morning, most of the time, most of it's gone. So over in this section here, you can see we've got 2 tanks. Now one is way more lit up than the other, but they've both got exactly the same lighting, and this is some of my favorite lighting. So these are like pendant style lights, they're on Amazon, I'll leave a link for these. My absolute favorite because they give a shimmering effect, well they would do if it didn't have absolute tons of floating plants. But look, that's my point. I would class this one here at the moment as low lighting, yeah? So at the moment the camera's compensating, but let me just adjust this, so like, let's see, I'm going through it manually, the light settings. That is about accurate as to how much light is going through. We've got carpeting plants, we've got crypts doing really well. We've even got the reds at the back, actually got some red on them. Saying that, there is way too many floating plants at the moment. Like that's blocking too much light, I would say. And if I kept it like that, the plants would sort of go a little bit more leggy and not look as vibrant. But the reason I do that is because I harvest these and I take them to the shop and then I swap them for fish and everyone can buy them as well because they're red root floaters at the end of the day and they're not that easy to get hold of for some people. And then next to that tank, as I say, exactly the same lighting, but look, without the floating plants, they're on the same like power setting and everything. And this has got so many plants in it, fast growing pearlweed, that you don't get algae, everything stays really vibrant. The only problem is actually it grows too fast, so I'm forever trimming it, and there's no CO2 or anything like that on either of these tanks. This one started with it for about 3 weeks or so, and I just couldn't keep up, so I just stopped it straight away, and since then it's just been going absolutely nuts anyway. But this one, it's not even got a filter on it, it's got no CO2, and like the plants grow absolutely amazing. It's a great little underwater jungle, and I just think the neons really set it apart. Looks great. Now over in this one, we have got my little better tank. This is what I'll class as low light. So again, it's got another little pendant. Same company as the last one, Lamini, but they do like a little miniature one, which works perfect for this size tank. It works well on a 60 centimeter as well. This is 45, but hello buddy. There's my betta fish. Really nice betta. So yeah, even at the bottom here, there's not a lot of light coming in, but we've got the boosters growing really well. We've got some Cryptocorini flamingo there that's even got some pinky hues. So even with low light, look, we can get really, really nice sort of plant growth. So that's what I'm trying to say to you. It doesn't have to be these massively high powered lights, because if you do go for that, and here is an example on George's tank that we set up recently, it's going for its diatom phase. Again, it's got one of those pendant lights on full power. We've got surface scum, we've got diatom algae, we've got like some string algae and stuff like that. It's still going through its like sort of cleaning phase. And at this point, I don't do anything. I just let it go through it and leave it. We've got some crypt mount at the back, but look, all the new shoots are coming through. Now it's about now, I'll start adding some algae eaters in, but we'll get to all of that later on. And as you can see here on my big 8-foot aquarium, I've got 3 more of the pendant ones as well. So just 3 of them for this massive size. I'm falling over the furniture. I can't even get it all in shot. Look at how well that lights everything up. I did originally buy 4, it was too much, but this is perfect. And look at the plant growth. It also reaches all the way down to the bottom here as well. And you can see that all the hair grass is slowly creeping across. This tank does use CO2 though. It's the only one in the whole studio, apart from the one I've just set up with George, that uses CO2. It's my showpiece tank, so I wanted to go all out. But I do use a lot of strip lights as well. Oh, I took that out earlier because it was making a noise. But yeah, I use a lot of strip lights as well. A lot of these are the Superfish scaper line ones. In fact, the whole fish wall is lit by those as well. They would be quite powerful for these small tanks, but obviously, as you can see, I've raised them up and put them into the recesses. So then that just means the light intensity when it gets down there is a little bit less, because there would be algae in all of these otherwise. And yeah, I don't really want to have to be maintaining that many tanks that are more for like quarantine and holding certain fish. And the triple tanks you can see here, these are also the Superfish scaper lights. And again, look at how good the plant growth is. So you do get a different vibe with the strip lights because it's just an even coverage. You don't really get a lot of shimmer either, unless you've got a ton of surface agitation. But for things like stem plants, it does mean you get an even coverage, and then that means you get like more vibrant colors, I suppose, across the board is what I'm sort of getting at. And then these two aquariums here are my most expensive lights. So these are the Chihiros Vivid RGB thingamybobs. But you can see, so this one's got a slight red tone to it, because you can change all the settings, the intensity, and again, that's what you're sort of paying for, really. You get the whole sort of app thing, and look at the reds in this tank. Because of the red, the light and the intensity, you just get them really vibrant. But the Amazon puffer tank, hello babies, they just had some food, look at their bellies. Look at the growth here. This is supposed to be like a forest. Need to do a little bit of a trim up in some of the sections because it needs to be more open, but it's just left to be more like forest-like, and I think it's getting that vibe for sure. The fish love it as well. I mean, I've only got 5. I've got 5 puffers in here, and it's a big old tank for 5 puffers. We've got Corydoras as well, all in the bottom, which are just, oh look, oh, there's an Otocinclus, and just behind it was a Cory. They're at the back at the moment. But yeah, so expensive lighting, you get amazing growth. With lights, you do really get what you pay for. And if you want to go high end, you won't be disappointed, let's be honest. It's just not always necessary depending on what you want to do. Like for instance, this is a little kit tank from Superfish. And all it's got, hopefully you can see the reflection, is 2 little, I don't even know what they're called, LED squares, I guess. So it's not like, they're not whoa, that's bright. They're not massive, but it's all part of the kit. Because I didn't want to do anything super high-end or that in this look, it works so well. It's the perfect lighting. It doesn't get algae, the plants grow nice and steadily, little shrimp tank, and yeah, it just works. So the point I'm getting at here is that you don't have to spend an absolute ton of money to be able to get really good plant growth. Now, obviously, if you're going for that high-tech look, you're going to want to spend a little bit more money, but don't start with that if you're new to this, that is. Start low, learn how to grow the plants with lower light, and you'll just find it so much easier as you progress. Like, instead of jumping right in at the high-end stuff, there's a lot more that can go wrong with high lighting, and not wrong, but like more algae, which causes frustration, which causes people to go, I just can't do it. Like, you know, for instance, the George Farmer tank there, it's got high lighting, it's got CO2, and it's got the biggest diatom outbreak I've ever seen. Now, that's been like that for about a week or so now. Granted, I've not done anything to it because I'm experienced enough to know now that just leave it, it'll sort itself out, it'll find its own balance. But when you're new, you're not like that, are you? It's your first tank, and you're like, this is horrible, I can't get rid of it, it keeps coming back, I'll get rid. Start with the real low tech, pick some plants, which we'll get to, that will work really well with it, and then you can move on. I think that's the best way of doing it. It's also fun sort of upgrading yourself as you go. It's kind of like setting smaller level goals for the greater end goals. So you start off with the lower tech, I've completed it, move on to sort of like a medium level light maybe, completed it, then we're on to CO2 and we're on the high tech lighting, you know, and you're just getting win after win, and it feels really good. Now personally for me, to start with, I think that the substrate system is more important than the lighting you choose. As I've shown, like you can pretty much put any lights on and certain plants will grow. Most plants will grow actually, it's just some will grow better than others. Some require a little bit more light to get them to look as beautiful as you want, but they'll still grow with low light. Now, many of you would have seen it's not my substrate system, but a substrate system that I've sort of adapted from multiple different trial and errors throughout the years. When I first started, I couldn't afford expensive aqua soil and things like that. So I had to just go right back to basics. I could afford some root tabs and some gravel. That's basically all I had available. And actually tell a lie, to start with, I couldn't even afford root tabs. I went and got some gravel, put a thick layer down, started putting plants in it, and they were melting off. Like, not to the point where they're completely gone, but like they're just little stumps. Now that's because gravel hasn't got anything in it nutrient-wise for the roots. But what it does do is store the fish poop, and eventually you build up a nutrient layer inside. And after about like a month or two, I started seeing plant growth, which just got better and better as more and more nutrients from the fish went into that gravel layer. So yeah, that works. Like lots of people say, you don't need all these chemicals and additives to your soil. Like you can use gravel or sand. Yes, you absolutely can. It just takes forever versus adding some nutrients. So the best thing I'd say start with is don't use gravel. Gravel can work, but don't get me wrong, it's not perfect because if you've got decent flow in the tank, you're constantly sort of wafting up bits of particles and stuff that's caught inside of it, detritus, mulm, poop, all that sort of thing. It doesn't kind of get locked down until the deeper layers. So that top layer is just constantly getting wafted back up into the water column. You can get cloudiness, just particles floating, it doesn't look as good. If you use sand, I find it's much better because stuff still penetrates it, it just takes a while. But most of the fish poop and mulm, it sits on the top, which means it's constantly getting wafted up, but at a much faster rate and just getting taken out by the filter. Many of you would have seen the substrate system I use now, which is I put like a base layer of nutrients down, like some pond, aquarium soil, things like that. It's also known as lily soil. It's basically the nutrients that you put in the baskets that you put pond plants in, stick them in your pond, and then it just sort of stays contained, but there's nutrients then for the plants, but it doesn't cause the water to go green or anything like that. It's just had some of the nutrients taken out versus normal compost, but it's just basically compost with less nutrients. Now I always put that down as a nice little base layer on top of some gravel and things like that, just to make sure it doesn't go all sludgy, but it's locked in with the gravel, and then I cap over the top of that with sand. Add some root tabs as well for any plants if they're gonna need it, like heavy root feeders, for instance, Echinodorus, that's going to use a lot of nutrients, big, thick roots that just send out this whole system, and they use nutrients fast, so I bump it up even more for those kind of plants, or just any plants in general. To be honest, when I'm using sand, the more nutrients locked underneath it, the better. And then the whole top is just capped over with a decent amount of sand. I'm not one of those people that think you need like half the tank filled up with substrate. I just don't think it looks very good. And most of us want to have this as somewhere in our house where guests come in and see it. And if they can see like half the tank is just soil or substrate or sand, I think it completely spoils the aesthetic. I mean, you can bank it up at the back and then you can't see it from the front, taper it right down, and you've still got a massive amount of biology going on underneath that sand. You know, beneficial bacteria, nutrient layer. It's going to last a long time as well, but it doesn't spoil the look of it. Now that said, I do it that way because I don't tend to use CO2 in 99% of my tanks. Now, what happens when you put compost and things like that underneath the sand is they break down over time, and in that breakdown process, CO2 is produced. Okay, it's not going to be the level of like injecting CO2, of course it's not. But any increase in CO2 in your water is just going to be so much better than none at all. Now, nearly all the tanks that you can see that have lots of plants growing like this one here have got that really thick substrate layer. But from the front, as I've said, look, it doesn't look like it. The back there, because of the illusion, the depth, looks like it's level, but it's not. This part here is a little bit less than the rest, but it comes right up at the back there. And then on the other side as well, it tapers all the way up to about a point about there. So inside of that like area, locked down by the sand, is tons of nutrients, lots of CO2 being produced. Not that it really matters on this one because I inject it as well. This is the only tank other than George's new one that there is CO2, and I just wanted to, you know, make it look absolutely brilliant as my showpiece. Because when you walk in the door, yeah, I'm stood in the door now, and this is the first thing you see when you come in. It just looks great. But again, the same thing is in this tank here, the self-sustaining one. I kept it tapered pretty flat all around here. You can see some of the nutrients working its way down and up through the sand, but the sand is ultimately locking the majority of it all down. Now over the other side, it actually tapers all the way up. So you've got a ton of nutrients. Here's a good example, the side profile here, look, of this tank. Look at all of that. That's all sand and nutrients and everything just clumped together. Some gravel in there as well, some old aqua soil. Basically, whenever I take down a tank, I just save everything. Capped over the top of this one with a huge amount of aqua soil as well. I went for extra because I knew I was gonna be planting lots of plants into it. But then for some tanks, we don't have lots of plants. Now, what do we do in that situation? Do we still create all the nutrients underneath the sand? Well, no, definitely not in a tank like this. Now, obviously, this is a planted tank tutorial, but just in case anyone is wondering, like here, we've got lots of fish that dig up sand and they're looking to create their own little homes. Plus I've got loads of bottom feeders as well, cyanodontis in there, which are all hiding in amongst, as well as the bristlenose plecos. So what you do here is oh, look at that, oh, he was just coming out then. Anyway, what we do with this one is just put down like an inch of sand all over, and then you just adjust the lights accordingly. So there's not a huge brightness coming from this tank. It looks great, and it's the right amount because the fish still look great. You get a little bit of algae on all the rocks so that the bristlenose have a constant food source because they just love to graze. But you adjust the lights as you go. Now initially I had them up too bright and the substrate was turning quite sort of green. If the substrate turning green, it means you probably got too much light, especially if you've got like a white sand like this. So I adjusted all these lights, turned them down, you still get a great shimmer, the fish look good, but it's not an algae fest. And it's kind of the same rules that you'd apply to a planted tank as well. That's kind of why I'm showing you. Light intensity is the overall factor in algae growth most of the time. If you've got enough nutrients that are locked down, the plants are growing well, but there's algae, there's probably too much light. If the plants aren't growing well, and there's algae, there's probably not enough light because there's not enough plant growth to combat the algae. Now, all that being said, it all becomes so much easier if you put just injected CO2 in your tank. I've found that if you put injected CO2 and just aqua soil, like literally nothing else, a good amount of aqua soil, and plant into that, and you've got a good dose of CO2 going in, everything just grows really, really well anyway. You probably get your initial outbreak of diatoms, but you put in some shrimp, maybe some bristlenose, they'll clean that up in a few days, providing it's not like completely caked. Like George's one, in a minute, I'll be adding in some amanos from another tank. One of them I just put all my amanos in and there's like way too many for there, so I'll switch a load over. And within a few days, most of those diatoms have been eaten and it'll be looking good again. So I know how to combat it, it's not an issue. But yeah, CO2, aqua soil, like I travel around to different people and different shops and stuff now to see the different systems they use versus me. And if there's CO2 running, it just makes it a hell of a lot easier. I'm not gonna lie to you, but I love the challenge of the low tech and finding that balance. The most fun thing for me in the hobby is getting a tank to the point where I don't have to do anything. That is my usual challenge. And when I get there, I'm like, oh yes, this is awesome. But yeah, that leads us on to CO2 systems, which I am by no means any expert in that. Like I say, I rarely ever use it. Now what I do use is the bicarb and citric acid method. You mix the two things together, you fill it with some water, the reaction takes place and makes instant CO2 that's locked in the container. It's pressurized, but obviously it has a shelf life. It's going to diminish over time. So usually with most of mine, they last between 1 to 2 months, depending on like how heavy I go with it or not. And I never go that heavy because I just don't feel it's necessary. But the ultimate and best way of doing it is you get the proper pressurized cylinder of like CO2 that's been pumped into it's pressurized. And then you get all the sort of outlets to come off of it and you can get multiple sort of pipe work go into all different tanks, and that can still last. A big canister like that can apparently last you like over a year. It's probably the most cost-effective way of doing it for sure, the neatest as well. I just stick with what I've got because I have it available. I wouldn't have a clue where to go and get CO2 from. I could probably find it, let's be honest, but I just have what I've got already and it works. But CO2, without a doubt, is the ultimate in planted tanks. Not only does it make the plants grow fast, they grow more compact as well. So they're not reaching for light, because if you've got CO2, you're gonna have a high light, aren't you? The two go hand in hand. And what that means is, like for stem plants, for instance, the nodes in between where new sort of leaves come off are closer together because they don't have to reach for the light. Like certain plants will stay really low in a full CO2 system with bright light. But if you put them in a low tech one, they'll get kind of high and leggy. So it's a different look. You also tend to get more vibrant colors with CO2 as well, but that isn't the CO2 itself, it's the light intensity that's causing that, which is why lots of people say, how do I get such bright reds in some of my tanks when I'm not running CO2? But the CO2 is not giving the bright red, it's the high lighting. I'm experienced enough now to be able to get to a point with a tank where I can ramp up the light and not get algae. I'd never do that to start with because you're just asking for trouble. But as time goes by, this is why I said earlier about getting adjustable lighting, you could just bring it up a little bit, bring it up a bit more. Really good plant growth coming in now, all over. Let's ramp it up a little bit more. And then you'll notice that the plants are much more red towards the top of the aquarium because they're closer to the light. And down the bottom, they're still a bit greeny or sort of browny, yellowy hues, which I don't mind at all. I actually like that. I like that graded look. I think it looks awesome. It just depends what you want. If you want to be all in, then you're not gonna be disappointed with a CO2 system. If you like the challenge and the simplicity of little pump in the corner, just pushing some water around, a low-cost light, lots of plants, get that ecology working really, really well, then you're onto a winner in that sense. For instance, I could just go away from my studio now for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if I had someone feeding, of course. I can go a week without feeding with my fish because they're so well set up. There's so much mulm and so much like microorganisms and things that they would just scavenge constantly and they would get a constant food source. I wouldn't leave them for over a week though. A week would be the limit. Some of the bigger fish as well, I still wouldn't be too happy because the piggies, the funny thing is the bigger fish actually could survive longer without food because they've got more fat reserves. The smaller ones actually need it more regularly. But yeah, my point is in a full CO2 system, if you went away for like a month and just had someone feeding and something changed in the tank when you weren't there, it could result in like some really disastrous things in the tank. You might come back to just like a complete algae bloom because the CO2 levels changed and the tank was so used to those CO2 levels. Whereas it doesn't matter on mine, literally doesn't matter at all because I don't change the water in them anyway, so that wouldn't matter. I mean, a month, we're gonna have some serious drop in evaporation from the top of the tank, but yeah, I'm not gonna leave it a month. It's just hypothetically, like my tanks are already like set. They're more like ponds in glass. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, I'm digressing from the point. CO2 is awesome, there's no doubt about that. It's just not a necessity if you ask me. It just depends what you want. If you're looking at like the high-end aquascaping channels, they're all using CO2. So if you want that specific look, which does look a lot more polished than my tanks, no doubt about it. If you want that look, you're gonna need the CO2 and the high lighting. So another important thing I think people should think about when they're decided to do a planted tank is the plant selection. Now, of course, we all want every single one to go in our tank and flourish and look amazing. And you can get to a point where that is the case. But to start with, given your water parameters, some plants might grow better than others. For instance, there's a couple of plants for me that don't grow as well as other plants like to completely flourish. Pogostemon halfari, I think that's how it's pronounced, never works for me, so I just don't bother picking it. But when I first started out, I had no clue what plants would and wouldn't grow. So every week I'd go get there was an offer in the shop, which was like buy 3 plants, get a 4th for free or something like that. So I'd always just do that, put them in, kind of still in the baskets as well, just plonk them in and just see how they sort of reacted. And any that were reacting well, I would just go get more of straight away. So yeah, you're gonna need to experiment to start with, just to see what's gonna work well for you and what you can grow really well. Also, it just feels good, seeing that plant you've got taken off and you're like, oh, I like that. Because most people, they just want bursts of green to start with, because it signifies like healthiness, doesn't it? The greener the plants, the more healthy they must be. So when that starts happening, you're like, I just want more and more of that. Now, as you move on and you get a tank full of that particular plant that did well, you start adding a few more in and just seeing what works. And eventually, you're going to have like a repertoire of, is that the right word? That's a stupid word. I'm not going to use that word. A short list, shall we say, of your go-to plants that you can stick in and they're going to work in the next setup. Or even if you change the current setup, put them back in and they're going to do well and then add to it and get more. Also, plant selection is quite key in terms of like startup. For instance, if you're going to do like an Anubias and slow-growing plant tank, like with bright lighting, probably going to take a while before that tank looks good. Sometimes it's good just to go get some pots of stems, like a fast growing stem. So for instance, what would I use for fast growing that I knew I could take out like very shortly after if it didn't suit the style? Would be something like Lindophylla, Siciliflora, something like that. That grows super fast, quite leggy in a low-tech tank, but still beautiful and green. I mean, I've done that before where I put it in the tank because it's fast growing to help the other plants essentially and not get algae all over them. And then it grew so well that I was like, oh, I love that, I'm leaving that. Snip some of the tops off. You can replant it as well, so you know, that's free plants effectively. So yeah, with plant selection, it's gonna be completely down to you what you wanna do, but I would say just try everything. Just try everything. I mean, one pot at least of each. You know, every time you go back to the shop, oh, I haven't had that one yet, I'll get that one as well. I'm there anyway, getting some fish or some more hardscape. Plonk it in and see how it does. You're very quickly going to find the stuff that works really well for you or for the light that you've got, for instance. You might not have a really high powerful light, which means that certain plants aren't going to look great. For instance, Ludwigia palustre super red won't go bright red without a powerful light, but it will still grow. It'll just have a different color tone to it, and sometimes it might look a little bit like, but as it goes higher and higher near that low light, it will definitely get red. I've had ones before where there's no color at the bottom and they've grown out of the tank and look like the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. What am I doing with my hand? Sorry about that. I do always talk with my hands. My wife's always like taking the mick out of me as I'm speaking, but yeah. So yeah, plant selection, get all of them, have a go, find out what ones grow for you really well with your equipment and your light, water parameters, stick with them, and you can just like try and tweak it later on as your skills get better as you upgrade your equipment. And still keeping in the theme of plants, but keeping it a little bit separate as well, is floating plants. Not everyone wants them in their tank because some people just don't really like how they look. But for me, they're very, very important, especially if you don't have a light that you can adjust. If you've got one that's just pretty basic, no adjustability in it, there are options actually. You can use some black electrical tape over some of the LEDs to bring it down. Some people just don't want to do that. It doesn't look as nice, does it? But floating plants are another option. They are very, very good at not only blocking out light, not completely obviously, but just dialing it back by 30% or whatever. They're also very, very good at pulling up nutrients from the water column. Sometimes too much. I've had instances where my floating plants were going absolutely nuts, and as a result, my Java ferns just were wilting away and not doing well. Purely because Java ferns are trying to pull nutrients from the water column, and because the floating plants are out of the water but the roots are in, they can grow so much quicker because they've got instant access to CO2 in the atmosphere. Plus their roots are then in the water, sucking up all these nutrients, and basically there was nothing left in the water column for my Java ferns to be able to grow. Now that's kind of like what you want, but it's finding the balance. So if your whole surface is covered in floating plants, there's probably not going to be much available in the water column for any of the plants that want to feed from it. Most of our plants we're going to be planting into the substrate, so they're always going to have a supply from the roots. But Java ferns and Anubiases, they need that nutrients in the water column. So floating plants are so good at doing that. When I've had outbreaks before of algae, sometimes all I've done is taken a handful of floating plants, plonked them into the tank that had the problem, and just that alone solved it. And then as they multiply, you just strip them back a little bit. I tend to sell mine to the shop. Well, not sell them, I give them to the shop near me, my local Maidenhead. They bag them up and then they let me have some fish. So it's like a bit of a trade. And then the customers get the option of some red root floaters, for instance. So yeah, there's three main floating plants that I like to use, and one that gets in that I don't want to use. So you've got duckweed, which is like the fastest growing thing, and it's so small and annoying, but it does such a good job of pulling nutrients out. I used to actively buy it and put it in my tanks, and now I just can't get rid of it. Most of them are clear, thank goodness. There's still one that I'm going to break down at some point soon and do something else. So there's duckweed. Second would be Salvinia. I think it's a good one. It's not the prettiest though, and it can look a little bit sort of grungy sometimes. The roots get like detritus and stuff in them. But it's a very realistic looking floating plant. Another one is red root floaters. I love these just because they give you that red pop. Also, they flower on the top as well sometimes, which looks really beautiful. Just another colour, in the upper area of the tank, because the roots go so reddy pink, and yeah, it looks great, especially with high lighting. Really works a charm then. And then the last one that I use is mini water lettuce, which the name suggests it stays mini. It doesn't. If you leave it long enough, it gets huge. But I mean, the parent one, the non-mini one, is like very huge very quickly. So I suppose it is mini in that sense, but it still looks quite big over time in your aquarium. Again, it sucks up nutrients fast. It's got nice, big, long root system. Can be very, very natural looking. I've found that floating plants give a natural vibe a lot more than anything else that you can put in your tank. For instance, if you had no plants at all, just cool hardscape, and you were like, I like the hardscape, I do want something, but not in the water, just putting the floating plants at the top with that green and the roots coming down could instantly transform it into some sort of Amazon-style tank. So yeah, even if you don't want floating plants, if you're starting up a new tank, I'd say get a pot of Salvinia from your shop or whatever, chuck them in the top and just leave them, forget about them. Like eventually you can scoop them out when all the rest of the plants have grown in and everything's getting settled. But to start with, they're such a good option just to help you out. Massive, massive help. I'd almost go as far as to say that like, I wouldn't be here today without them. Because I reckon a lot of my tanks would have just been like grimy and I would have gone, it's too difficult. Because I didn't have the lights that you could adjust, and it wasn't until I put floating plants in because I was going for a certain look, I realised how much they actually helped. And now every one of the tanks pretty much has got floating plants unless they don't need them. Right then, a subject that I know a lot of you would be keen to have clicked on the video for, fertilizers. What a minefield. I mean, even for me, it's just like so much information, so many different ways of doing it that like you can read one and be like, okay, I'm set on that. And then you see someone else saying you should do this. And you're like, oh, well, that's contradicting that. Well, which one is right? Well, I do it quite differently to anyone, I think. Well, not anyone, most what people say online anyway. So there's like the estimated index, which is different levels of micro and macronutrients depending on what your tank needs. I mean, that's quite a science experiment. There's lean dosing, there's high dosing, there's all these sorts of things. I'm just saying words now because I don't really know what all of those are because I just keep it so simple. So you can get like several kinds of fertilizers. The one I use, a lot of you know, it's basically got like iron and potassium in it, which is the majority of what your plant needs. Now I just put that in. I don't even do it like that regularly. Most of the time it's when I top up the water level, which is about once a week. I put in what's recommended and then I just leave it at that. And what I'm really doing there is relying on the fish waste to add all the other nutrients that's needed. Now that could be wrong. Everything I say to you in this video is not me saying it's correct. All I know is that it works really well and the plants grow to the level that I want and need them to. And obviously I think that this changes with high CO2. For instance, the plants are growing like turbocharged, so they're going to be using all the nutrients turbocharged as well. So the CO2 systems, I think people tend to use a bit more of a complex fertilizer that's added. But for the low tech, I mean, most of the nutrients are going to be fed from that substrate system. I sort of treat the fertilizer, the liquid fertilizer that goes into the water column, as like a bonus. Sometimes you can see some of the leaves of a plant or a group of plants looking a little bit less sort of vibrant and good. And that's when I always add more. Like if I see plant growth slowing down a little, I add more fertilizer as well. But I do a lot of it by eye. Like I'm looking at the tank, which is probably not the best way because prevention's better than cure, but you know, I need some indication. And if I just see that they're not popping as much as I'm used to, in starts going a bit more fertilizer because obviously what I was doing wasn't enough. Now when I say they're not looking as vibrant, I don't mean that they're looking like completely gone, not by a long shot. To anyone coming in, they'd still think they look beautiful, but obviously I can notice the difference because I'm seeing them every day. So yeah, with fertilizers, I suggest, especially when you're starting, keep it simple. Some people love going into the detail and the knowledge and the science behind it because that's part of the hobby for them as well. And if that's the case, yeah, crack on, get right in there. I mean, it's experimenting, it's fun seeing the results. I mean, I've just found it not that necessary. And some people have suggested this because of my water parameters. But I mean, yeah, we should get onto water parameters next because I think that's probably quite important as well. Now, something I've noticed in this hobby is that when someone doesn't get the same results as you, they automatically either assume you're cheating or that like you've got some magic water that means everything works for you, but it doesn't work for them. And the reason I say this is because quite a lot of people used to say, or maybe still say, I don't really know, I don't look anywhere, but the only reason I get this growth with such simple methods is because I've got magic water. Now, I think what they mean by that is like it's soft water is what they describe it as. See, to me, sometimes that's a bit confusing. Does soft mean low pH, or does it mean like it's not full of tons of minerals and things like that, which would cause issues? So let's just look into that a little bit. My pH sits at 7, which is, you know, neutral. Add a little bit of bogwood and some things like that. You can get it down to about 6.8, 6.9, which doesn't sound like a big difference, but that is actually quite a decent drop. The lower your pH, the more availability, I think, of CO2 in the water. And it also just, plants seem to love a lower pH. Now, people always said this, and I assumed it was correct as well. I was like, well, you know, I live in this area. If you go further, a little bit further to the east of me, the pH is like 6.5, where the shops and stuff are that I usually go to. It's 6.6, 6.7, and that's because they have like a bog area that like all the water goes through first. Anyway, that's not the point. So I tend to get a TDS of around 100 at the tap, which is quite low, yeah? And I'm thinking, okay, that sounds like beautiful water, like a well or something like that. Up in Scotland, I think it's similar sort of levels, like really good. But as you go towards London from my country, I'm in the southwest, so as you go to the southeast towards London, you start experiencing more chalkiness, and the pH goes up a bit, and so does the TDS to about 400, something like that. So that's quite massively different from how I have my tap water here. So again, I'm thinking, okay, they must be right. But recently, about 6 months ago, something like that, so quite recent, I went to Aquarium Gardens, which they describe it as liquid rock water. And they wanted me to do my style of aquariums and how I set them up, which is completely different to them. Usually it's always high-end stuff with aquarium soil, you know, aquasoil, CO2, very, very expensive lighting, constant maintenance routines that they have, like strict maintenance routines. And yeah, like completely different to how I do it. I just basically set up a system and leave it. So they wanted me to do that in the shop, and I was a little bit apprehensive because I was like, okay, well, everyone's saying that this won't work over here. Your water's completely different to how mine is. But the tanks have now been running, like I say, over 6 months, and they look amazing. So they've still got the same system that I use. The one difference they do is that they do regular weekly water changes, just because they're doing it on all the other tanks, I guess, as well. But the tanks look absolutely brilliant. Now, if they're doing water changes in a tank that's had bogwood in, all they're actually doing is resetting the pH level up higher again, because the bogwood would have leached and lowered it. So they've got higher pH than me, they've got higher total dissolved solids and everything like that, like 4 times as much on the tap. But the tanks still look amazing, they grow plants amazing. So I don't really buy into this as much. I mean, there will be cases, of course, with people with crazy water, but the majority of the time what I'm seeing is that my methods will work whether you've got hard water or soft water. And when I go over to America and talk to people over there as well, they always want to show me their tanks. I say, oh, okay, so the systems are working really well for you. Oh, absolutely brilliant. I've got like 8 or 9 tanks now, which is brilliant. That's always what I want to hear. And I always tend to say to them, what's your water like? They say, oh, it's hard, you know, it's hard. You know, so I'm hearing completely different, conflicting real-world evidence as to what a lot of people are saying online, and just going, you shouldn't try that because he's just got magic water. I don't believe that to be true at all. I think sometimes people run into some problems and they haven't looked at other areas. It's probably easier for them just to say, I haven't got the right water for it, so that doesn't work for me, so I'm going to do this. As in like RODI water, remineralizing. I mean, that is probably the ultimate way of doing it, but there's no way I'm going to be doing that with all of my tanks. And if you don't need to, then I don't think you should have to. A higher pH does make things harder. Sometimes the only way to bring it down is to add CO2, because adding CO2 to a water naturally brings the pH down. And that's why some areas will require more CO2 than others, because you've got to inject more to bring that pH down. But yeah, I've seen so many examples of amazing looking tanks from completely different tap water to me, and then the next person that comes along has got completely different tap water again. So, I mean, I personally don't think that is a big a factor as people think. I think a lot of the time it is either not enough nutrients, too much nutrients, not enough light, too much light. And like I say, the best way to work out what is going on there, if your plants are growing really well, you know, you can see fresh shoots coming off all the time, and then the previous lot is all coated in algae, you've probably got too much light. If the plants are staying really stumpy and not really growing, it's been a good while, then there's not enough nutrients and too much light. Right, then moving on to another subject, filters. These, again, it can be so confusing for new people. Do they need a canister, a hang on the back, an internal one, a sump? Sometimes people want to use as well. The answer to it is they all work. Now, the reason I know this is because I've done tanks without them really, really well. As you've seen, you know, the no filter tank there, the self-sustaining one. Like, if you can grow amazing plants without them, then they're only going to grow even better with them. They should be used as a tool, not a necessity. So I put them in to help pick up particles, but I don't really use them as the whole biological entity for the whole tank. Obviously they're going to add to that and it's going to be of benefit, but a lot of the biological cycling process is all done in my substrate systems the majority of the time. Obviously that's not the case in certain tanks, and in those ones, for instance, Mabuna tank with just sand, you're going to want a decent canister filter in there that's going to hold some media. Just because you haven't got as much in the tank, you've got the rocks, you've got the substrate, but there's not a huge amount underneath. So in a tank like that, yeah, absolutely, get the biggest filter you can. But I think one thing that's more important than the actual filtration type is to get some flow in there. Now you can do tanks with zero flow, zero filters. They are very, very difficult, mind you, and you can run into a few problems to start with just because there's not enough plant growth providing oxygen and water movement and that kind of thing. So the main reason I use filters is just to clean up and just generate some nice flow. And most of them are gonna do that. I mean, even just a surface skimmer to push water around is enough, in my opinion. But again, this is one of those things. If you spend money on a really good filter, you know, it's got a heater built in, it's got like a pre-filter that you can clean out. It's all just gonna make your life easier, and it is gonna make the whole process probably more enjoyable as well, because there's less to have to do. Most canister filters, you can leave them for about 6 months with no problem at all. I've done that so many times with no issue, especially if they've got the pre-filter built into it, which you can just sort of clean out the sponges and that quite regularly, once a month. And then when you actually go inside the canister, it's not really dirty anyway, because that pre-filter has been cleaned regularly. But you might be one of those people that wants to get one and you want to know what one to get. For me personally, I think you cannot go wrong with a decent canister filter. Benefit of it is you don't have to put anything into the tank other than the pipes. And also it's very easy just to switch it off, take it out and clean it when you need to. But having said that, I've got plenty of tanks where I just have little internal filters, mainly just to push it around, a little sponge on it, picks up any debris and that kind of thing. They work really well as well. In a smaller tank, they can look a little bit ugly, but most of the time if I do a small tank and have a little internal filter, I try and hide it behind some of the hardscape or something like that, so you can't see it anyway. And if you've got a black background, then it's a black internal, then you're not going to be seeing it anyway once the plants have grown in. So filtration for me is one of those that is very dependent on your budget. If it fits your budget, just get it. It will be absolutely fine. If you want to upgrade later on, you can, but you don't have to. It's pretty much the same with all equipment. All of it works to a degree. It's just how far you want to take it. Sumps, I can't really talk about them too much because I've never really used them, but I've seen them in action. And for ease of maintenance, it does look very, very simple, doesn't it? Like you open up your cupboard at the bottom, you go and you take in what needs cleaning, just take it out, turn off the pump, and put it back together again. I mean, that seems like the most easy way of doing it, but not everyone wants to have this big extra thing of water at the bottom. It's probably the ultimate in filtration, isn't it, a sump? Because quite often you're doubling the volume of water, which means more dilution of any nasties that get in there. But like I say, not everyone wants to do that. Go with a canister filter, I would say. You can't go wrong with it. But if you want to do the internal thing, will work absolutely fine as well. Water changes. Now, there's been some controversy about this online recently. So some people are saying, do not change your water. And you know, quite often I've made a lot of tanks where I use the tagline, no water change aquarium, which is actually true. I pride myself on being able to set up an aquarium that can just get to this balanced state that I really enjoy, and I don't need to do water changes, I just top the water up. But that doesn't mean I'm gonna sit there and say to everyone, do not change your water. Like 100% change your water if you need to change your water. Like the only way of knowing that really is testing. So I'm at a stage now where I don't test the water unless I really have to. I can see that there's a problem. Usually that's determined by how the fish are behaving. But because I've done it so much now, I very rarely need to, except for when I've just set it up. Well, most of the time I'm changing water then anyway for the first few weeks. We're whipping it down, we're whipping it up, just because I want to get it nice and clear, looking beautiful, running nice. But you know, the longer the aquarium goes on, the less water changes that I do. And it's just because I feel like I don't need to. But if I did need to, 100% would. What determines if you need to? Well, if your nitrates are pushing up really, really, really high because you're feeding too much, or you've got big fish in there, and the plant mass can't deal with that amount. I mean, by that point, you're probably gonna have a lot of algae as well, because that's more food again for the algae to grow. But 100% change your water if you need to. Don't ever let anyone say it's bad for you. Like, I should probably do more water changes because it will probably boost the mineral levels in the water for the plants. I don't because I'm lazy. But then I know it's not bad for the tank not to. I just don't feel that it's necessary. But if I could see that the tank was going downhill in terms of how it was looking, it needs a bit of a refresh, the water's a bit tanned, you know, I want that crispness back, I'll 100% do a water change. Not 100% water change, but I 100% will do a water change. I tend to do about 50%, you know, and that could be because I've left the tank for 6 months without doing it at all. So yeah, like don't stick to like you have to do this and you have to do that. Do whatever works for you. And if you feel you need to do a water change, then do it. And again, I guess water testing, water changes, they sort of tie in together. Do you need to water test? Maybe you don't. There's lots of people who say test kits are a waste of money. It's usually people that have been in the hobby for a long time and just like, they don't use them, so no one needs them. Now, that's not the case at all. Like, especially for people when they first start out, definitely get a test kit. Like, if you can only get the strips, it's still better than nothing and gives you some sort of barometer as to what's going on. The key things that you're looking out for is nitrite and ammonia. If ever you see any spikes in that, it's probably best just do a water change. It can only be a positive thing for the tank, so yeah, just do it. Always make sure obviously you dechlorinate the water as you do it, but you know, other than that, it's gonna be good. When you think of a river system, you know, there's constantly fresh water, you would hope. It's kind of freshening everything up. To be honest, all of the top aquascaping channels and stores and stuff do weekly water changes. I just like to do things in a little bit of a different way and love the idea of getting it to thrive on its own with minimal interference, and I'm lazy. So stocking levels in your tank. This is, yeah, I'd say that's pretty important for when you're starting, because if you just set it up within a few days, some people like to cycle a tank like with ammonia and things. I don't actually do that. I always use fish to cycle my tank. Now, I don't just go and get the full amount that I want in the tank and put it in straight away. Sometimes I have done that, very rarely, but when I've done that, I've normally used some filter media from another cycled canister or something like that that's gone in. But if I'm starting off very fresh, you know, I've filled the tank up, I've made sure that the water's dechlorinated, I'll put 2, 3 or 4 fish in the tank if it's like a good size, like a 60 centimetre, something like that. If it's a bigger tank, obviously a few more. But to go in and put the full stocking level in there on day one is not a very good idea at all, because you're gonna have like too much background ammonia in the water. Now, it might not be enough that it's gonna kill the fish, for instance, especially if you've got a heavily planted tank, a big substrate system, but it will be enough that it's extra food for the algae. Algae will consume ammonia to grow. And if there's quite a lot in there, not to the detriment of the fish, but if there's like background levels in there, it's just additional fertilizers for algae. A lot of what I'm getting at is that we do not want algae in the startup phase as much as possible, because it's the sort of thing that just makes people stop doing it and just feel like they can't grow plants. They're like, oh, I can grow algae really well. I suppose at the end of the day, algae is a type of plant. Essentially, it's not quite the same, but it uses nutrients in the same way a plant does. So if you've got excess nutrients, then algae will grow. So for stocking levels, then bring it up slowly. It's fun, isn't it? Like to go to the fish shop each week, maybe you get a little bit of extra hardscape, but you're really there to get 5 more of your favorite fish to add to the group or something like that, because you're building the stock steadily. It is the best way to do it for sure. Now, you also need to make sure that you're picking the right fish for a planted tank. Some cichlids, they like to eat plants. Luckily, everything we've got here doesn't, although some people would say that a royal acara of, you know, Chunks' size would eat plants, but he doesn't, never has, not interested. And you'd look at him and think, yeah, he's definitely gonna munch on some greens. But no, he doesn't. And lots of people have said as well that Mabuna, they eat plants. They nibble. I think they've had a nibble previously on another scape I did for them. I had a lot of Anubias and sort of tough leaf plants, and they didn't chew them all. They were there the whole time. The only reason I changed it up like this is because it's a bit more naturalistic for them, and I wanted the colours of the fish to pop more and didn't want the green of the plants to distract from them. I think that's worked out really well. But yeah, you've got to be aware of the fish you're choosing. Do some research to take a look. Majority of tropical fish are going to be absolutely fine with plants. But yeah, just be wary. If you're going for big South American cichlids, I mean, I'm pretty sure some of them would just destroy a lot of plants. But from what I've read, plants like Anubias, you can see here of my electric blue acara, apparently they taste funny to the fish, and that's why they don't eat them. Like the thicker they are, the more they've got like this bitterness to them. I guess someone's just guessing that, because how would they know that the fish thinks it's bitter? But they don't seem to eat them. So yeah, hardy plants, I would say, definitely go with any kind of bigger cichlids. But it's always going to be a bit of experiment. Like, you can read somewhere that, oh, you can't put Mabuna with plants, and I've done it absolutely loads. So yeah, you could experiment. Try a few plants first, I would suggest, if you're dead set on a specific fish, because there'd be nothing worse than spending like $200-300 on a bunch of plants that you put in, and then you wake up in the morning and they're not there anymore. Now, something that I alluded to then was called fish in cycle. Now, it's quite controversial. Some people say that it's not okay, it's bad for the fish, but like, I've been doing this for 6 years now, and it's the only thing I've ever done. The whole cycling a tank with little drops of ammonia and things, like getting it up to a certain level so the bacteria level is correct, it confused me so much. So quite early on, I saw the fish in cycle option, followed the advice of what people were saying, and it's always worked well. Basically, you put 1 or 2 fish, depending on the fish tank size, in straight away. They start to produce waste, and then you get bacteria forming to compensate for that. And then you add a few more and a few more and so on, and it just grows. The bacteria levels grow with the amount of fish and the waste being produced. To me, that makes a lot more sense, simplifies everything, keeps it safe, than trying to adjust ammonia levels for the right amount of bacteria. Is it the right amount of ammonia for the amount of fish that are going to be stocked? What if the fish that you thought you were going to get are of a different size? So maybe they're too small for what you thought, which means a load of bacteria die off, which is not too bad in terms of like detrimental to the health of the fish, but the tank would kind of crash for a bit and go murky and that sort of thing. What if the fish are bigger than you thought? All of a sudden there isn't enough bacteria. You know, there's so many variables involved in doing that. For me, it was just like whoosh. So I just do the same method I've always done, a couple of fish first. When I started out, I really did stick to like 1 or 2 fish first. Nowadays, I'm far more like sort of aware of what's going on in the tank just visually. I can see if there's a problem with the fish pretty quickly. I don't really take any chances anyway, because I just test. I test the water. If I put fish in, the very next day straight away, any signs of ammonia or nitrite, we whip the water down, we bring it back up again, dechlorinated obviously as well, but then that's just nullified any of the problems, any of the ammonia that was like growing or increasing in the tank. So you're getting rid of that ammonia, but of course the fish are still there, so the bacteria levels are still growing. I think for sure it takes more work, but I mean, how hard is it to whip some water down and fill it up again? Not that hard, especially if you've only got like 1 or 2 tanks. So yeah, for me, I think it's the best way of doing it. I also think it's the safest way, because it's not so complicated to work out what to do. Like, just follow some simple steps and it should be absolutely fine. So moving on to something that's maybe quite often overlooked, but I've left it to the end because without sorting out stuff beforehand, it's not really going to help. We're talking about a cleanup crew. A cleanup crew does not do everything unless you've got like the tank just full of them. So a lot of the time when people think of a cleanup crew, they've already got to the point where their just tank is covered in algae and things like that. And they're thinking, I'll just put a few like bristlenose or some otocinclis, some snails, maybe some amano shrimp, or even just cherry shrimp, and that will sort it all out. It's likely that that is not going to be the case if it's already got to that point. You probably needed to adjust some other parameters of anything else before that point. So if your tank is going through a diatom phase at the start of the, when you've just set it up, then a cleanup crew will work really well. They always do. And by that point, it's probably a perfect time to be adding them in as well as the first fish. That's quite often what I do. I'll just leave the tank until the diatoms are in. It's sort of cycling itself with waste from some of the plant and stuff. There's a bit of ammonia, which is creating bacteria in the tank. Okay, the diatoms are taken off. We can put our first fish in and they're gonna sort of get cleaning on that straight away. But if you've had the tank running for quite a while, you've got like big green thread algae, there's just algae everywhere. Sticking a cleanup crew in at this point is kind of like weeing in the wind, shall we say. The algae are there for little background levels of algae, and like they're helping you clean. They're not doing the whole job, again, unless you've got like 40 amanos, say in like a 60 centimeter tank, something like that, which you shouldn't need to do. So yeah, providing you've got the right lighting levels, and more often than not, if you've got the nutrients sorted, that's what it's going to come down to. Like, bring your lighting levels down a bit, and then you can add in a few bristlenose. I find work really, really well, and about 5 amano shrimp in a tank this big. If you're going for like a tank that's like as big as a person, for instance, you're going to want a lot more than 5. You're going to want maybe 20, 25, something like that. Again, you don't have to, because some tanks will just balance and it's not really necessary. But I think personally, if you put them in, it isn't going to help. Now remember, you've got to like adjust to whatever other fish you've got in there. Don't go sticking some little amanos in there with, for instance, Chunks, because I'm pretty sure Chunks is going to munch. He might not, because he's quite chill. But, you know, they're not cheap amano shrimp, especially where I am anyway. So if you're going to put them in with bigger fish, they might get eaten. In that case, there's two other options, which would be the bristlenose and the snails as well. So for me, I like to use ram's horn snails just because they breed really fast. They do a great job. They don't eat plants either. So snails are like for me, I go hand in hand with a planted tank, and I know a lot of people don't like them, and I've had people commenting saying, stop trying to force snails on us. I'm not forcing them on you, it's up to you what you do, but every single one of my tanks have snails in, and it's just, whether it's deliberate or not, they get transferred over and whatnot. But a lot of people worried about the population of snails because they do breed so fast, like tenfold, tenfold, tenfold. But what you find is that when a tank's balanced itself and you've got into a routine of feeding, the amount of waste that's left is the level of numbers that the snails will grow to. Any more will just die off because there's a lack of food. If there's food available, they'll keep breeding. So if they're just breeding tons and tons and tons, it probably means you're feeding too much to your fish, because there's so much waste left over, or there's a lot of poop from the fish. So there's just a resource for them to keep growing in numbers. Like, none of my tanks are really overrun with snails at all, unless I deliberately want them to be. So I've got one of my tanks over there which is just used for breeding out the snails, because I also want to feed them to my puffers, and I'm just constantly putting food in that. And as a result, there's tons and tons of them, but that's exactly what I wanted. The rest of them, they've found their own little equilibrium, but I would put snails as my #1 best thing for algae eater. Pond snails, like bladder snails, and ram's horn snails for me. I think neurite snails are really good as well for eating certain algae, but I tend to stay away from them because they leave these white eggs everywhere that like just don't come off. I can take the wood out and scrub it and they're still on there, and that does my head in, especially when I know that ram's horn snails and bladder snails just do a great job anyway. So yeah, they're cheap. That's another thing that's great. They're so cheap and they breed easy. So I would say, like, I'd always say to people, if you've got a planted tank, put them in there, let it balance itself, you know, and all good. If you don't want to use them, I understand, that's absolutely fine. Go with amanos and bristlenose. Cories are good as well, but I don't class them too much of a cleanup crew. They're more like sort of somewhere between your beautiful fish and your cleanup crew, aren't they? They do a great job of stirring the substrate to waft food or leftover food or poop up into the water column that the filter then takes out. So they do a great job of that, but let's face it, they're also like beautiful looking. Not the bristlenose aren't, but you know, my wife certainly doesn't think so, especially the male. She's like, ooh, they freak me out. But you know, I think they're quite cool anyway. When I say cleanup crew, I don't mean they're just like, it's not. I think it's cool to be part of the cleanup crew. You know, the unsung heroes of the tank, aren't they, really? So yeah, make sure you get one, but don't rely on them. They're just there for background levels to be kept in check. But if it's like going crazy, other things need to be adjusted, which more often than not is going to be the lighting level. Too high, probably. Okay then, a very long video there, guys, but we covered a lot of topics. Hopefully I've held your attention and you've learned a few things. Feel free, anyone, to comment anything on anything that's been said and get more advice, like a community vibe in the comment section. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it and it was useful to you, and I'll see you on the next one.